A motorcyclist kicks dogs for amusement, unaware that one of them belongs to a police detective. Detective Jake Miller treasured these rare moments of peace. The crisp autumn breeze rustled through the trees as he strolled through the park with his wife Emily and their two beloved dogs Buddy and Daisy, happily trotting ahead. These walks had become a cherished ritual for the family, a chance to unwind from life's demands and reconnect. Emily's laughter rang out as Buddy tried to chase a falling leaf, his short legs working tirelessly. Daisy, the calmer of the two, stayed close to Emily, occasionally glancing up at her with devoted eyes. Jake smiled, savoring the simple joy of the moment. "You know," Emily said, threading her arm through his, "we should do this more often. The dogs love it, and honestly, I've missed having you all to myself." Jake squeezed her hand, silently agreeing. His demanding job as a detective often left little time for such moments, making them all the more precious. Just as he was about to reply, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the roar of motorcycles. Two riders wearing leather vests with the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club emblem sped past, deliberately revving their engines to disrupt the tranquility. The riders, later identified as Chuck and Roy, circled back, hurling insults and taunting their dogs. Jake felt Emily tense beside him as Buddy and Daisy barked anxiously. Despite his years of training, the situation took a sharp turn when one of the riders, Chuck, swerved closer and kicked Buddy. The small dog let out a pained yelp, causing Emily to gasp and immediately kneel to check on him. Daisy barked furiously, while Jake observed the situation with a calm but focused demeanor, noting the details, their vests, the bikes, and their smug expressions. "Are you both okay?" Jake asked, kneeling beside Emily and the dogs. Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she comforted Buddy, who seemed more startled than hurt. "Who were those men?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite her evident worry. "They seem to be trying to provoke us deliberately," Jake replied, helping her up. His detective instincts had already begun piecing together what had just unfolded. "Let's head home," he said, his tone calm but resolute, ready to confront the situation if needed. Jake said quietly, keeping a protective arm around Emily as they walked home. "I don't like how they were sizing us up." The walk was tense, their earlier peaceful mood shattered. Jake couldn't shake the suspicion that this was no random encounter. The riders' calculated provocations and the way they had circled back felt intentional, as if they were testing boundaries. Once home, Jake ensured Emily and the dogs were safe inside before pulling out his phone. He contacted colleagues in the local police force who might have information on the Iron Wolves. As he waited for replies, he stood by the window, watching Emily comfort the dogs. Buddy, already seeming to have forgotten the incident, dozed peacefully in a patch of sunlight. But Jake couldn't forget. His instincts, sharpened by years of detective work, told him this was just the beginning. The Iron Wolves had a reputation that preceded them, not known for random violence, but their presence in the neighborhood was alarming. Jake's mind raced. Why had they targeted his family on what should have been a peaceful Sunday? Emily approached him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "You're worried," she said, her tone soft but certain. "Just being cautious," Jake replied, turning to face her. "I'm going to make some calls and find out what I can about our new friends." "Promise me you won't do anything rash," Emily said, knowing her husband's protective instincts all too well. "We don't need this turning into something bigger." Jake nodded, but deep down he knew it was already bigger than it seemed. The Iron Wolves didn't act without a purpose, and he intended to find out what that purpose was. The following days passed with an unsettling quiet that only deepened Jake's concerns. His investigation into the Iron Wolves revealed a pattern of intimidation and illegal activity. Chuck and Roy, the riders from the park, had a history of harassment and vandalism. They thrived on creating chaos, and Jake's unease grew. Emily did her best to maintain their normal routine, but Jake noticed her caution. She would check the street before taking Buddy and Daisy out for walks, always sticking to daylight hours. Even the dogs seemed more alert, Daisy especially, tensing at the sound of approaching motorcycles. On Wednesday afternoon, the fragile calm shattered. Emily was preparing dinner when her phone buzzed with a new message. Jake noticed the color drain from her face. "Emily?" he asked, crossing the kitchen in 2 quick strides. "What is it?" Wordlessly, she handed him the phone. On the screen was a photo of their house, taken that same day, accompanied by a chilling message. "Nice place you got here. Shame if anything happened to it." "They've been watching us," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as Buddy and Daisy played innocently in the next room. "Jake, what do they want?" Jake pulled her into his arms, his mind racing through the possibilities. The Iron Wolves weren't known for aimless intimidation. There was always a motive. Jake's jaw tightened. Whatever the reason, they had crossed the line, and he was determined to protect his family at all costs. "I'm going to increase our security," Jake said, mentally listing everything they needed: new locks, security cameras, and other reinforcements. Yet he knew these measures were only a temporary fix. To truly resolve the issue, he needed to confront the Iron Wolves directly. The challenge was how to do it without escalating the situation further. That evening, after ensuring Emily and the dogs were safe, Jake made a series of calls to his law enforcement contacts. Each conversation revealed more about the Iron Wolves, particularly their leader, Pry. Unlike Chuck and Roy, Pry was described as charismatic and disciplined, a leader who valued maintaining order within his organization and, surprisingly, had a reputation for fostering positive community relations. This gave Jake an idea. "I don't like this," Emily said when Jake explained his plan to visit the Iron Wolves clubhouse. She sat on the couch, stroking Daisy's fur while Buddy dozed at her feet. "These aren't reasonable people, Jake. They threatened our home." "Pry isn't like Chuck and Roy," Jake replied, sitting beside her. "From what I've learned, he runs a tight ship. The Iron Wolf have a code, and what those two did, harassing us and threatening you, violates it." Emily frowned, unconvinced. "And you think he'll just listen to you, a stranger walking into their territory?" "Yes," said Susan. Jake nodded, though he understood her skepticism. "If nothing else, he'll want to know that 2 of his members are acting recklessly and bringing attention to the club. That's bad for business." Persistence from the club. As they discussed the risks, Jake's phone buzzed with another message from his contacts. This time it contained details about growing tensions within the Iron Wolves. Chuck and Roy had been causing problems for weeks, pushing boundaries and creating internal conflict that Pry had been working to contain. "There's something bigger going on here," Jake said, showing Emily the message. "It's like Chuck and Roy are deliberately stirring trouble. But why us?" They looked at the shiny hair form of the woman who wore the plain diplomat's clothes. Jake stepped closer. Emily leaned against him, her worry evident. "Just be careful," she said softly. "Whatever you decide, remember you have us to come home to." Jake squeezed her hand as Buddy stretched in his sleep, paws twitching as though chasing dream rabbits. The sight strengthened Jake's resolve. He would protect his family, but he would do it with intelligence, not brute force. The next morning, Jake prepared for his visit to the Iron Wolves clubhouse. He chose civilian clothes that wouldn't immediately mark him as law enforcement, but still projected authority. From the bedroom doorway, Emily watched him, Buddy, and Daisy sitting at her feet. "I still think this is dangerous," she said, her voice softer now, though her worry lingered. "But I trust you. Just promise me you'll be careful." Jake crossed the room and kissed her forehead. "I promise. This ends today, one way or another." What he didn't tell her was that he had already set up a backup plan, trusted colleagues on standby, ready to act if things went south. But as Jake headed out, he felt confident in his approach. Sometimes the best way to diffuse a volatile situation wasn't with force or threats, but by appealing to reason and honor. The Iron Wolves clubhouse stood on the outskirts of town, a repurposed warehouse that exuded both simplicity and menace. Jake parked a block away, taking a moment to observe the scene. Several motorcycles gleamed in the late morning sun, their chrome reflecting flashes of light. As he walked toward the building, the casual chatter of the members outside abruptly stopped. Every eye turned toward him, scrutinizing and assessing. Jake kept his pace steady, exuding confidence without provocation. A tall man with a salt-and-pepper beard stepped forward, blocking his path. "Private property," the man growled, his tone more a warning than a threat. Jake met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "I'm here to see Pry. It's about Chuck and Roy." The mention of those names caused a subtle but noticeable shift among the gathered members. The man exchanged a glance with another, who promptly disappeared into the clubhouse. Moments later, though it felt longer, the door opened, and Pry stepped out. Pry's presence was commanding, not through bravado but quiet authority. He wasn't the caricature Jake had expected. Instead, he exuded genuine leadership, his dark eyes sharp and assessing. "You're either very brave or very foolish," Pry said, his voice carrying across the now silent yard. "Coming here alone." "What?" Jake held his ground. "I'm here because we have a mutual problem, two of them, actually." Price faced downward and held his breath as he waited to see what might happen. Pry's expression remained unreadable, though a flicker of curiosity shone in his eyes. He gestured for Jake to follow. Inside, the clubhouse was unexpectedly well-maintained, a functional yet inviting space with a bar, comfortable seating, and a private meeting room. Pry led him there, closing the door behind them. "Talk," Pry commanded, settling into a chair at the head of a long table. Jake remained standing, carefully weighing his words. "Chuck and Roy have been causing problems in my neighborhood. They threatened my family, sent photos of my house. That's not just harassment. That's asking for attention. And I don't think anyone here wants that." Pry's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression betraying nothing. "And why should this concern me?" "Because they're doing it wearing your colors," Jake replied evenly. "And from what I've learned, that's not how the Iron Wolves operate. You have a code." A flicker of surprise crossed Pry's face, quickly masked. "You've done your homework, but you still haven't told me who you are." Jake hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Detective Jake Miller, off duty, here as a husband and father." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not looking to escalate things. I just want to resolve this before it gets out of hand. For both of us." Pry leaned back, studying Jake intently. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment heavy. Finally, Pry spoke, his tone measured. "You've got guts, detective, I'll give you that. Now tell me, what exactly do you propose we do about this?" "I'm someone who could make things very difficult for your club if I wanted to," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm also someone who believes in handling things the right way first." Pry leaned forward, his interest piqued. "The right way?" "You keep order in your club, I respect that," Jake replied. "Chuck and Roy aren't just disrespecting my family, they're disrespecting everything you've built here." The room fell silent. Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycles and muffled conversations added to the tension. After a moment of consideration, Pry stood and said, "Wait here." He left the room and Jake could hear raised voices outside, though he couldn't make out the words. Several minutes later, the door opened. Pry returned, followed by Chuck and Roy, who looked defiant but uneasy. These are serious accusations, Pries said, his tone sharp. Both men instinctively straightened. Threatening families? Taking pictures of their homes? That's not what we do. Chuck stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He's lying. We're just having some fun with the dogs. Enough, Pries snapped, his voice like a whip. You've been pushing boundaries for weeks. Now I find out you're targeting innocent families? He turned to Roy, who stood silent and fidgeting. And you? Nothing to say? Taxonomus has removed your planet from exclusion. Roy shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Pries' expression hardened. In one swift motion, he stepped forward and removed the club rings from both men's fingers. You're out, he declared, his tone final. Turn in your vests and leave. You're no longer Iron Wolves. Shock flashed across Chuck and Roy's faces, quickly replaced by anger. Before they could protest, several other club members appeared at the doorway, their presence making resistance unwise. The two men were escorted out, their expulsion clear. Pry turned back to Jake. It's done, he said, his voice steady. But you should know, men like that, they don't take humiliation well. Watch your back. Jake nodded, understanding the warning. Pry had done what he could, but the threat wasn't entirely gone. As Jake left the clubhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that one problem had been resolved, but another had just begun. Within days, Chuck and Roy's presence in Jake's neighborhood became impossible to ignore. Their motorcycles appeared at random times, often parked strategically around the block. The deliberate revving of their engines in the early morning hours was clearly meant to intimidate. Emily noticed the change in their usually friendly community almost immediately. Neighbors who typically chatted on their lawns now hurried inside at the sound of approaching motorcycles. The local coffee shop where Emily often worked on her laptop grew quieter as customers stayed away when Chuck and Roy loitered outside. The once peaceful neighborhood was tense, and Jake could feel the pressure mounting. Chuck and Roy, now loose cannons with nothing to lose, seemed determined to make their presence and their anger felt. Jake knew it was only a matter of time before their reckless behavior escalated further. They're using the neighborhood as their new hangout spot, Emily observed one evening, peering through the living room window. Across the street, a group of neighbors who had been chatting quickly dispersed when Chuck's motorcycle appeared at the end of the street. Buddy and Daisy, usually enthusiastic about any outdoor activity, stayed close to the couch, their unease matching the tension in the house. Jake nodded, his jaw tight. They're smart about it. They haven't done anything illegal enough to warrant police intervention, but they're making their presence impossible to ignore. A sudden knock at the door made them both freeze. Jake approached cautiously, relaxing slightly when he saw Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, through the peephole. Opening the door, he found her looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began, wringing her hands, "but I thought you should know. Those two men on motorcycles, they've been asking questions about your schedule, when you come and go." Her words made Jake's stomach drop. He invited her inside, exchanging a concerned look with Emily. Once seated on the couch, Mrs. Henderson continued, drawing comfort from Buddy and Daisy, who had settled at her feet. "They cornered my grandson, Tommy, yesterday while he was delivering newspapers. He said they were particularly interested in when you're away from home. They tried to make it sound casual, but Her voice trailed off as she absently petted Daisy. "Thank you for letting us know," Emily said softly, sitting beside her. "Has anyone else mentioned anything similar?" Mrs. Henderson nodded. "The Martinez family across the street. And I heard they caused a scene at Mike's corner store yesterday. Mike had to threaten to call the police to get them to leave." After Mrs. Henderson left, Jake's phone rang. It was Officer Thompson, a colleague who patrolled the neighborhood. "Hey, Jake. Thought you should know those two troublemakers you asked me to watch. They've been making waves at local businesses. I just responded to a disturbance at the coffee shop. Nothing we could arrest them for, but they're definitely pushing boundaries." Jake paced the living room, his mind racing. "They're escalating, trying to show they can disrupt daily life. Have you noticed any patterns in their movements?" "They're mapping out the neighborhood," Thompson replied. "Learning routines, traffic flow. Jake, this feels organized, like they're building up to something." After ending the call, Jake found Emily in their home office, where she had been working remotely more often since the trouble began. She looked up as he entered, her face a mix of worry and determination. "I've been reviewing our home security footage," she said, gesturing to her computer screen. "They're not just trying to intimidate us, they're studying us, trying to understand our patterns and weaknesses." Jake leaned over her shoulder, examining the footage. It showed Chuck and Roy's increasing presence in the neighborhood over the past week. Their appearances, initially seeming random, now revealed a deliberate pattern of surveillance. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a timestamp. "They show up every day when our neighbors leave for work. And here, they park near the coffee shop right before the morning rush starts. They're not just intimidating people. They're learning everyone's schedules." Jake felt a swell of pride in Emily's investigative skills, coupled with growing concern. "They're isolating us, making the neighborhood afraid while gathering intelligence for something bigger." Buddy and Daisy's sudden barking drew their attention to the window. Outside, a motorcycle cruised slowly past their house, the rider openly studying their home. Emily reached for Jake's hand, squeezing tightly. "We need to act," she said, her voice steady but firm. "They're not going to stop until we do." "They don't know everything about us, do they?" Emily said, her voice steady but resolute as she squeezed Jake's hand. "They might be watching our house and tracking our routines, but they have no idea what we're capable of." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "You're right. They're building their strategy on assumptions, that we'll stay passive, that we're isolated. But we have the advantage of knowing their plan now, and we're not alone in this." As the night deepened, Jake and Emily put their plan into motion. The first step was rallying their community, the very people Chuck and Roy were trying to intimidate. Jake contacted several neighbors, including Mrs. Henderson and the Martinez family, explaining the situation in detail. His words were met with both alarm and determination. "We can't let them take over our streets," Mr. Martinez said during an impromptu meeting at Jake's house. "If we stand together, they'll see they can't push us around." Kathy Frisbee, played by Katherine Griffith. Jake outlined a strategy to monitor and report any suspicious activity while keeping a low profile. Emily suggested creating a neighborhood watch group, and within hours, they had a system in place for sharing information through group messages. The once silent community was now unified, ready to stand against the threat. Meanwhile, Jake continued digging into Chuck and Roy's activities. With Emily's help, they monitored the online groups where the two ex-bikers were rallying their newfound coalition. The more they observed, the clearer the plan became. Chuck and Roy were orchestrating an event designed to provoke both the Iron Wolves and the community at large. "They're planning to escalate soon," Jake said, showing Emily a new post from one of the groups. "Look at this. They're hinting at a big move, something they think will make a statement." Emily frowned, scrolling through the comments. "It's all bravado, but they're feeding off each other's anger. They've convinced themselves they're the heroes of their own story." Jake's phone buzzed again. It was another anonymous message. "They'll make their move tomorrow night. Be ready." He was overwhelmed by the next day. Jake finalized preparations. He alerted his law enforcement contacts, who promised increased patrols in the area, though Jake knew they couldn't intervene unless a crime was committed. He also coordinated with the neighborhood watch, ensuring everyone was aware of the potential threat and ready to act if needed. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked as they reviewed their security footage one last time. Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've done everything we can to prepare. They're underestimating us because they think fear will keep us frozen. But they're about to find out that fear works both ways." As night fell, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Jake and Emily stayed vigilant, their home security system active and their phones within reach. Buddy and Daisy stayed close by, their usual playful energy replaced by watchful quiet. The afternoon air was close and thick, as if they were hidden in the chains of... The hours ticked by, and then, just as expected, the roar of motorcycles shattered the stillness. Jake glanced at Emily, who nodded. It was time to face the storm and ensure that Chuck and Roy's attempt to assert control would be the last mistake they ever made. Jake sighed, understanding Emily's skepticism. "No, they're not," he admitted, "and Pry has something to lose here. Chuck and Roy are dragging his club's name through the mud and undermining his authority. He needs to end this as much as we do." Emily frowned but nodded slowly. "It's a calculated risk, then." Jake gave a small, reassuring smile. "Exactly. And we're not relying on them entirely. We're keeping control of our side of things. Pry's help is an added layer, not our only defense." By mid-morning, the dark sedan had left, but its presence had left an unmistakable message. The escalation wasn't just bluster anymore. It was calculated, organized, and growing in intensity. Jake received a follow-up message from Pry. "We're sending someone trustworthy to watch your area. You'll know them when you see them." Shortly after, a motorcycle pulled into the neighborhood. Not the usual aggressive revving of Chuck and Roy's antics, but a smooth, deliberate approach. The rider, a woman wearing an Iron Wolves jacket, parked discreetly on the far end of the block and nodded subtly toward Jake's house before blending into the area. Emily noticed her too. "That's Pry's person?" Jake nodded. "She's here to keep an eye on things, and she'll report back if Chuck and Roy try anything." As the day wore on, Jake and Emily worked together to shore up their preparations. Emily dove deeper into the online activity, tracking Chuck and Roy's digital movements. Her sharp eye caught new posts, suggesting a specific timeline. "Watch tonight. We'll make sure everyone sees what happens when they cross us." "They're planning something for tonight," Emily said, showing Jake the thread of comments. "They're framing it as some kind of public spectacle." Jake's jaw tightened. "They're escalating. But they don't realize we've already seen this coming. We created the leader among the factions, but they've turned into an exile group of favored few." The president bowed in respectful acceptance. As night fell, the neighborhood watch Jake and Emily had organized came to life. Trusted neighbors discreetly stationed themselves at key points, ready to alert Jake if anything suspicious happened. Pry's trusted rider remained nearby, an additional layer of vigilance. Jake and Emily stayed close to the windows, monitoring the street while Buddy and Daisy rested nearby, their usual playful energy subdued by the tension in the air. Around 10 p.m., the first sign of movement came. A series of motorcycles gathering at the far end of the block. Jake could see Chuck and Roy among them, their smug posturing visible even from a distance. "They're making their move," Emily said, her voice steady but laced with apprehension. Jake nodded. "And we're ready." As the group of motorcycles began to move toward the house, Jake's phone buzzed. It was Pry. "We're in position. Let them make their play. We'll shut this down before it gets out of hand." "Good." Jake shared the message with Emily. "It's time." As the motorcycles approached, their engines roaring to announce their presence, the neighborhood stood its ground. Porch lights flicked on, a silent message of solidarity. Pry's rider, along with a small group of Iron Wolves reinforcements, appeared from the shadows, boxing in Chuck and Roy's group before they could reach Jake's property. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Pry himself arrived moments later, his commanding presence silencing the chaos. "You've pushed your luck too far," he growled at Chuck and Roy. "This ends tonight." As the neighborhood watched from their windows, the Iron Wolves dealt with their rogue members, making it clear they wouldn't tolerate further escalation. Jake and Emily stayed inside, ensuring their family was safe. But the message was clear. Chuck and Roy's reign of intimidation was over. When the last motorcycle left the neighborhood, Jake exhaled deeply, finally allowing himself to relax. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you think it's over?" "For now," Jake replied. "But we'll stay vigilant, and next time, they'll know they can't break us. Or our community. They're escalating in ways I didn't anticipate," Jake murmured, his eyes scanning the newly arrived images. The photo showed Chuck and Roy handing a thick folder to an unidentified man. The exchange was happening in a dimly lit parking lot, the faces barely visible, but the posture and intensity of their interaction were unmistakable. Emily leaned closer. "What do you think's in the folder?" "Could be anything. Documents, plans, leverage," Jake replied. "But the fact they're involving new people tells me this goes beyond a simple revenge plot. They're trying to destabilize both us and the Iron Wolves." Jake's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Pry. "We identified the man in the photo. Ex-member of a rival club. Known for dirty tactics. This is bigger than we thought. The Departé and several other clubs. They're not just targeting us and the Iron Wolves," Jake said grimly. "They're aligning themselves with people who want to dismantle the Iron Wolves entirely. This isn't just personal anymore, it's political." Emily's brow furrowed as she pieced the puzzle together. "So, they sabotage the bikes, make it look like infighting, and then let their new allies sow chaos in the aftermath?" "Exactly," Jake confirmed. "They want to weaken Pry's position within his own club and create a vacuum for chaos to thrive." Emily stood, determination hardening her expression. "Then we need to move before they can execute their plan. If they think they're in control, we can use that to our advantage." Jake and Emily spent the rest of the day refining their strategy. They coordinated with Pry, sharing the new intel and devising a plan to expose Chuck and Roy's actions while neutralizing their growing influence. Pry agreed to quietly position his most trusted members near the storage facility that night, ready to intervene if necessary. "We'll handle this together," Pry assured Jake during their final call of the day. "If they want to play games, they'll learn the hard way that they're outmatched." That evening, as rain began to drizzle, Jake and Emily set their plan into motion. Using the security footage and the patterns they'd uncovered, they anticipated Chuck and Roy's next move, another meeting at the storage facility on Mason Street. With Pry's support, they positioned themselves to observe the activity while staying out of sight. Sure enough, just after midnight, Chuck and Roy arrived, their truck loaded with crates. Moments later, the man from the earlier parking lot exchange appeared, this time accompanied by two others. The group began unloading the crates, their movements hurried and deliberate. Jake signaled Pry's team, who moved in with precision. The Iron Wolves emerged from the shadows, surrounding the group before they could react. Chuck and Roy's defiance quickly turned to panic as they realized they had been outmaneuvered. "You've been busy," Pry said, stepping forward, his voice icy. "Too bad you didn't plan for this." The confrontation was swift. Pry's team restrained Chuck, Roy, and their new allies, while Jake and Emily documented everything. The crates filled with tools and fake Iron Wolves markings, the plans for further sabotage, and the damning exchange of documents. It was all the evidence they needed to tie Chuck and Roy to a broader conspiracy. When it was over, Pry turned to Jake. This ends now. You've got everything you need to take this to the authorities. My club won't be dragged down by their schemes." Jake nodded, gratitude and resolve in his expression. "We'll make sure they face justice for everyone they've hurt." The following morning, with the evidence in hand, Jake contacted his law enforcement colleagues. By evening, warrants were issued, and Chuck and Roy were arrested, along with their accomplices. The neighborhood, once plagued by their intimidation, began to return to normal, its residents reclaiming their sense of safety. As Jake and Emily sat on their porch that evening, Buddy and Daisy at their feet, they finally felt the weight of the ordeal lift. Emily reached for Jake's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We did it," she said softly. Jake smiled. "We did, and we made sure they won't hurt anyone else." Jake smiled too. The distant sound of a single motorcycle drifted through the air, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was a reminder of an unlikely alliance that had helped protect what mattered most. "They're planting evidence," Jake said quietly, holding up the photos on his phone. "Look at these papers. They're designed to look like internal Iron Wolves documents. They're creating a paper trail." Emily gasped as the realization hit her. "They're not just trying to damage the club's reputation, they're trying to frame them for something bigger. And by extension, frame you." Jake nodded grimly. "Exactly. The sabotaged bikes, the fake documents, all of it is meant to lead back to that storage facility. They want to draw us there and make it look like we're involved." But he suddenly let out a low growl. His ears perked. Through the window, Jake and Emily saw a familiar car cruising past the house, one of Chuck and Roy's new associates. "They're watching to see if we've figured it out," Emily observed, stepping away from the window. "They want to know if we'll take the bait." Jake's phone buzzed with a new message from one of his police contacts, anonymous tip about suspicious activity at the storage facility. "They're trying to force your hand." The pieces were falling into place. Chuck and Roy weren't just seeking revenge. They were orchestrating a sophisticated plan to discredit both Jake and the Iron Wolves. The storage facility wasn't just a trap. It was the stage for their final act. "We need to warn Pry," Emily said, reaching for her phone. "If they're trying to frame the club, his people could walk right into it." Jake raised a hand, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "Wait, maybe we can use this to our advantage." Jake was starting to feel a bit like old world knowledge, like he was properly assisting. Emily caught on quickly, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "If they think their plan is still secret, we can turn their trap against them." Jake nodded. "Exactly. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and we could end up playing right into their hands." Over the next few hours, they devised a counter-strategy. They coordinated with Pri and Jake's law enforcement contacts, quietly setting up surveillance around the storage facility and tracking Chuck and Roy's movements. The Iron Wolves members also kept a discreet watch, ensuring the trap would work in their favor. "They've put too much into this plan to back out now," Jake said as they reviewed their evidence. "When they realize we're not reacting as expected, they'll push harder, and that's when they'll slip." Emily nodded. "We need to be ready for that desperation, because that's when they'll make their biggest mistakes." The next few days were a tense dance of surveillance and counter-surveillance. Jake and Emily maintained their usual routines, giving Chuck and Roy's watchers nothing out of the ordinary to report. Meanwhile, Priya's people and Jake's police contacts steadily gathered evidence. "They're getting sloppy," Emily noted one morning as she watched another unfamiliar car pass by their house. "They're patrolling more often, but they're being careless about staying hidden." Jake, reviewing the latest reports from Pri, agreed. "They think we're still in the dark. The longer we don't react, the more impatient they get." A message from Pri confirmed it. "They're adding more evidence to the storage facility. getting sloppy in their rush. They're building towards something big. Their impatience is their weakness, Jake said. It's time to turn the tables. On the night Chuck and Roy were expected to make their move, the trap was set. The storage facility was surrounded by hidden surveillance teams, including Prey's trusted people and undercover officers. Jake and Emily stayed at home, ensuring their own security, while monitoring the operation remotely. Shortly after midnight, Chuck and Roy arrived at the facility with their new allies, hauling another load of incriminating evidence. They were confident, laughing as they planted the final pieces of their elaborate trap. But they didn't realize their every move was being documented by law enforcement and Priest's team. When the authorities moved in, Chuck and Roy's smug expressions turned to shock. They were caught red-handed with the fabricated evidence and tools used to sabotage the bikes. Their allies, equally stunned, tried to flee, but were quickly detained. The following morning, Jake and Emily received confirmation. Chuck, Roy, and their associates were arrested, with overwhelming evidence tying them to the sabotage, planted documents, and conspiracy. The neighborhood was safe again, and the Iron Wolves' reputation, rather than being tarnished, was vindicated. As they sat on their porch with Buddy and Daisy at their feet, Emily turned to Jake. They thought they were outsmarting us, but we used their arrogance against them. Jake smiled, his arm around her shoulders. Sometimes, the best way to win is to let your enemy think they've already won. Until it's too late. The distant hum of motorcycles echoed in the background, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was a sign of solidarity, a reminder of an unlikely alliance that had stood against a common enemy. Chuck and Roy's scheme was unraveling before their eyes, their every hasty move revealing more about their intentions. Jake and Emily stood united, dissecting each piece of information and preparing to turn the tables. They're trying to create witnesses before anything even happens, Emily said, her tone sharp as she gestured to her computer screen. She had been monitoring Chuck and Roy's orchestrated social media campaign. Posts were popping up across local groups, hinting at suspicious activity at the storage facility. They're building a narrative, Jake agreed, leaning over her shoulder to study the posts. When they spring their trap, they want people primed to believe their story. The more chatter there is now, the easier it'll be to spin the situation later. Their discussion was interrupted by Jake's phone. It was Officer Thompson. Jake, we've had multiple calls about suspicious activity at your house, Thompson said urgently. What's strange is, the calls are coming from people we don't know. People who don't even live in your neighborhood. They're laying the groundwork, Jake realized. Fabricating a paper trail so that, when they make their move, the evidence will already be stacked against us. Emily pulled up their security feeds, her expression hard. They're trying to manipulate the narrative. Whatever happens, they want it to look like we're the ones in the wrong. Would you not? Buddy's ears perked suddenly, and moments later the sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air. But it wasn't the aggressive roar of Chuck and Roy's bikes. These were the steady, disciplined rumbles of Iron Wolves' riders. Prey had positioned his most trusted members strategically around the neighborhood, ensuring a visible presence while quietly gathering intelligence. The alliance between Jake's family and the Iron Wolves had grown into a seamless operation, leveraging the club's street knowledge and Jake's law enforcement connections. It was an unusual partnership, but an effective one. They're going to make their moves soon, Jake said as he and Emily reviewed their plans one final time. And when they do, it'll be designed to leave us no good options. But they don't know we've seen through their plan, Emily replied, her voice resolute. They think they're dealing with a regular family and a motorcycle club. They have no idea we're anticipating their every move. Instructive. As night fell, Jake received another message from Prey. Intercept some chatter. They're planning something for tomorrow night. Mentioned using your dogs to force a confrontation. Strike team is here and headed for Sin. The mention of Buddy and Daisy made Jake's jaw tighten. He shared the news with Emily, who immediately went to check on their beloved pets. The sight of them dozing peacefully in their favorite spots strengthened her resolve. "They think the dogs are our weakness," Emily said, her voice firm. "But they don't realize they're actually our early warning system." Jake managed a grim smile. "They've spent all this time studying us, our routines, our habits, thinking they've found the perfect way to trap us. But they've overlooked the most important thing. We've been studying them right back." And as they prepared for bed that night, the pieces of their counter strategy were falling into place. Chuck and Roy had built what they believed to be the perfect trap, but in their desperation, they had overlooked crucial details. Their haste was making them careless, and Jake intended to exploit every misstep. "Sometimes the best trap is the one your target helps you build," Jake said, as he double-checked their security systems. The tension in the air was palpable as the night wore on. Jake and Emily spent the evening meticulously reviewing their plans. Pry's latest report added another layer to the puzzle. They've been moving equipment into the industrial warehouse all afternoon. It's clear they're gearing up for something big." Jake turned to Emily, his expression resolute. "Tomorrow night, we end this, but we do it on our terms, not theirs." Emily nodded, determination shining in her eyes. "Let's make sure their trap backfires spectacularly." Jake's mind raced as he watched the bikes pass by their house. Each rider was deliberate, their movements methodical. Chuck and Roy's final reconnaissance was confirmation that their plan was nearing its climax. "They're making sure all the pieces are in place," Jake said quietly, glancing at Emily. "They want everything to go perfectly tomorrow." Emily, her face set with determination, tapped on her tablet, reviewing the plan they had pieced together. "They think they've accounted for every possibility. They think they're in control." She looked up at Jake. "But they haven't planned for us." Throughout the evening, Jake and Emily coordinated with Pry and their trusted law enforcement contacts. Every piece of intelligence confirmed what they suspected. Chuck and Roy's elaborate scheme was designed not only to entrap Jake in the Iron Wolves, but also to control the narrative through staged evidence and carefully orchestrated witnesses. "They're building a story," Emily said, pulling up the footage of the car that had passed by earlier, its driver filming their house. "Everything they do is about creating the perfect image. Sabotaged bikes, fake documents, witnesses who'll only see what they're supposed to see." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. "And tomorrow, they're planning to put it all into motion at the warehouse." With some effort he spoke, pain crawling through his jaws. Pre's latest message brought another piece to the puzzle. They've spread rumors about a big Iron Wolves gathering. They're creating a scenario where it looks like the club is up to something illegal. Jake leaned back, deep in thought. "They want an audience," he said. "People who will see exactly what they want them to see and spread that story. But what if we give them an audience they can't control?" Emily's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean turn the tables?" Jake nodded. "Exactly. If they're counting on witnesses to sell their story, we need to make sure the truth gets out instead. That means documenting everything and having the right people in the right places." The preparations went into overdrive. Emily worked with Pry's team to coordinate hidden cameras and discreet observers near the warehouse. Jake reached out to Officer Thompson, who agreed to position undercover officers nearby, ready to step in if necessary. "We can't let them dictate the narrative," Jake said as they finalized their plan. "We need undeniable evidence of what they're doing, not just to stop them, but to make sure no one can twist the story." As the night wore on, Buddy and Daisy remained alert, their instinctive unease a constant reminder of the stakes. The dogs moved between the front window and the back door, watching and listening. Their behavior mirrored the tension in the house. "They know something's coming," Emily said, scratching Buddy behind the ears as he stood at the window, his posture tense. Jake's phone buzzed again. Another update from Pri. "They've set up inside the warehouse. More equipment, more staging. We'll keep eyes on them through the night." Jake relayed the message to Emily. "They're doing their final prep. This is it." Oh! Early the next morning, as the sun began to rise, Jake and Emily reviewed the final details of their counter-strategy. The trap was set, not for Jake and the Iron Wolves, but for Chuck and Roy. "They think they're running the show," Emily said, her voice firm. "They have no idea we've been 2 steps ahead this whole time." Jake smiled grimly. "And when they spring their trap, we'll be ready to expose it for exactly what it is." Jake moved swiftly to the security monitors, his brow furrowing as he studied the live feed. The approaching motorcycles weren't following the disciplined, steady rhythm of the Iron Wolves' patrols. Instead, the bikes moved erratically, their engines revving aggressively. Moments later, "That's not the Iron Wolves," Jake said, his tone sharp. "It's Chuck and Roy's people. They're testing us, seeing if we'll react." Emily joined him, her expression calm but determined. "They're trying to draw us out before their big move. They want to provoke us into making a mistake." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. "We won't give them the reaction they want. Let them think we're staying passive." As the morning wore on, the tension in the neighborhood grew. The phone calls to Officer Thompson continued, each one adding to the fabricated narrative of conflict between the Iron Wolves and local residents. Social media buzzed with posts hinting at escalating tensions, many of them suspiciously aligned with Chuck and Roy's agenda. "They're setting the stage," Emily said, scrolling through the posts. "By the time they make their move, they'll have half the town convinced there was already trouble." Jake's phone buzzed with another update from Pri. "More equipment spotted at the warehouse. They've turned one of the rooms into a control center. Cameras, monitors, and even a communication setup. This is big." "They're not leaving anything to chance," Jake said, showing the message to Emily. "They want to control every angle, every detail, every reaction." Emily's gaze hardened. "Then we need to be ready for every possible scenario. We can't let them dictate the outcome." Buddy and Daisy, ever vigilant, seemed to sense the rising tension. They alternated between the front window and the back door, their postures alert. When a familiar car made another slow pass by their house, both dogs barked, their warning clear. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore," Emily observed as she glanced out the window. "They're watching to see if we're nervous." Jake turned to her, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Let them watch. Let them think we're sitting ducks." By mid-afternoon, final preparations were in place. Jake had coordinated with Pri and Officer Thompson to ensure every angle was covered. The Iron Wolves had discreetly stationed members around the warehouse, their presence unnoticed by Chuck and Roy's crew. Meanwhile, law enforcement had undercover officers ready to move in at a moment's notice. Emily reviewed their home security systems one last time. "If they try to use Buddy and Daisy to force us out, we'll know immediately. The cameras and alarms are set." Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're ready for them. They think they've outsmarted us, but they don't realize they've been playing into our hands this whole time." As night fell, the final piece of Chuck and Roy's plan came into view. The motorcycles returned, this time accompanied by a van. Jake and Emily watched through the cameras as the van backed up to the warehouse entrance, its doors opening to reveal crates of equipment. "They're moving everything into position," Jake said. "Whatever they've planned, it's going down tonight." Emily leaned closer to the monitor. "Then tonight, we end this." Jake nodded, his eyes hard with resolve. "On our terms." "That's new," Emily remarked, her tone sharp as she watched the group of motorcycles circle their block through the security cameras. Their riders slowed down just enough to make their intentions clear, their postures arrogant as they turned their heads deliberately toward Jake and Emily's house. "They're escalating," Jake said, his voice calm but laced with tension. "This isn't just surveillance anymore, it's intimidation. They want us to feel like we're running out of options." Emily glanced back at the security feed, analyzing the movements. "But they're still trying to stay just outside our reach. Look, every pass keeps them at the edge of where our cameras can track. They don't want us to have clear evidence of what they're doing." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "They're testing how much we'll react, trying to gauge how close they can get before we push back, but they're also giving themselves away. Every move they make reveals more about their strategy." Again, the afternoon unfolded with a tense rhythm. Vehicles and motorcycles passed by with unnerving regularity, their presence a constant reminder of Chuck and Roy's impending move. Reports from Pre and Officer Thompson painted an increasingly clear picture. Chuck and Roy's allies were spreading out, setting up observation points and preparing to funnel Jake and Emily toward the warehouse. "They're creating a controlled environment," Jake said as he reviewed Emily's analysis on her tablet. "Every road they leave open leads straight to the warehouse. They want to choreograph every step we take." Emily frowned. "They're trying to force us into their narrative, making it seem like we walked right into their setup." "But that's where they've miscalculated," Jake said. "They don't know we've mapped out their entire plan. They're so focused on controlling the stage, they haven't realized we've been building our own." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, the tension grew thicker. Pry's latest update confirmed Jake and Emily's suspicions. They're stationed all around the warehouse district. Observation points are set, and they're waiting for you to take the bait. "They're ready to spring their trap," Emily said, her voice steady. "They think they've set up the perfect ambush." "But they don't know we're not walking into it blindly," Jake replied. "We're leading them right into their own web." The sudden roar of motorcycles outside interrupted their planning. Buddy and Daisy barked urgently, their hackles raised as they stood at the window. On the cameras, Jake and Emily watched as a group of riders slowed in front of their house, deliberately making a show of their presence. This time it wasn't just Chuck and Roy's crew, it included unfamiliar faces, likely part of their recruited allies. "They're bringing more people into this," Emily observed. "They're trying to overwhelm us with numbers, make it seem like there's no way out." Jake's jaw tightened as he stared at the screen. Let them think that. The more confident they are, the sloppier they'll get. And when they make their move, we'll be ready. As the group of motorcycles moved on, Jake and Emily resumed their preparations. Their plan wasn't just to survive Chuck and Roy's trap, it was to expose it, turning every element of their elaborate scheme against them. With Pry's team and the police ready to act, the stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the truth and dismantle Chuck and Roy's network. Emily checked their surveillance feeds one last time. "Tomorrow, we don't just spring their trap. We make sure it's the last one they ever try to set." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, his resolve matching hers. "Tomorrow, this ends. On our terms." Emily tapped the screen, highlighting the footage captured by a neighbor's security camera. "They're staging near the corner of Maple and Fifth," she said, zooming in on the grainy image of several vehicles parked in a seemingly inconspicuous formation. "But look closer. They're not just waiting, they're coordinating." Jake leaned in, his sharp eyes scanning the footage. "They're blocking side streets, ensuring there's only one clear route, straight to the warehouse." Emily nodded. "They think they've accounted for everything. They're leaving us no choice but to take the bait." Jake stood, his expression calm but resolute. "Then we take it, but not the way they expect." The tension in the air was palpable as night fell over the city. Chuck and Roy's network was in full motion, their final preparations underway. The security feeds showed vehicles circling the neighborhood less frequently now, signaling that most of their people were converging on the warehouse. Pry's latest update added clarity to the situation. There's staging equipment inside the warehouse. Looks like recording gear, too. They're setting up for their big reveal. They're preparing to expose us, Emily said, her tone edged with disdain. They're so focused on controlling the narrative, they don't realize they're being watched from every angle. Jake glanced at their own feeds, noting the subtle changes in Chuck and Roy's tactics. They're playing their final hand. Now it's our turn. The plan Jake and Emily had crafted with Pry's team and law enforcement was intricate, designed to flip Chuck and Roy's narrative on its head. Their countertrap hinged on patience, precision, and timing. Cameras were discreetly placed near the warehouse and along key routes, ready to capture every movement Chuck and Roy's team made. Undercover officers were stationed nearby, ready to intervene the moment things escalated. Buddy and Daisy, as always, were on high alert, their watchful behavior serving as an additional warning system. When the dogs perked up again, Jake glanced at the monitors and saw what he'd been waiting for: movement near their property. "They're making their final approach," he said, his voice low but steady. "It's time." Emily pulled up the map of the neighborhood, overlaying it with live camera feeds. "They've blocked every exit except the one leading to the warehouse. They're making sure we have no choice but to head there." Jake smiled grimly. "Good, let's give them what they want, just not the way they expect." As Chuck and Roy's team moved into position, Jake and Emily executed the first phase of their plan. They activated a series of decoys, lights and movements triggered in areas near the routes Chuck and Roy had blocked off. The distractions drew their surveillance team's attention, making them think Jake and Emily were trying to evade the funnel toward the warehouse. At the same time, Pry's team discreetly closed in on the warehouse, their presence unnoticed by Chuck and Roy's people. Law enforcement set up checkpoints out of sight, ensuring no one could leave the area once the operation began. "They're reacting," Emily noted, watching the feeds as Chuck and Roy's observers redirected their focus to the decoys. "They think we're panicking." "Let them," Jake replied. "The more they focus on what they think we're doing, the less they'll see what's really happening." By the time Jake and Emily's car appeared on the road leading to the warehouse, Chuck and Roy's team believed their plan was working perfectly. Vehicles positioned themselves to follow, subtly but closely, ensuring Jake and Emily reached the track. Inside the warehouse, Chuck and Roy waited with smug confidence, their staged setup ready to spring. But as Jake and Emily pulled into the warehouse lot, Pry's team and the undercover officers sprang into action. Hidden cameras captured the entire confrontation as Chuck and Roy's carefully constructed narrative unraveled in real time. Their planted evidence, recording equipment, and even their coordinated observers became the very proof of their deception. Chuck and Roy's attempt to frame Jake and the Iron Wolves backfired spectacularly. By dawn, the operation was over. Chuck and Roy, along with their key allies, were in custody, their elaborate scheme exposed. The evidence gathered not only cleared Jake and the Iron Wolves, but also painted a damning picture of Chuck and Roy's conspiracy. As the sun rose, Jake and Emily finally allowed themselves a moment of relief. Sitting on their porch with Buddy and Daisy at their feet, they reflected on the ordeal. "They thought they were pulling the strings," Emily said, smiling slightly, "but they forgot one important thing." Jake chuckled. "The best traps are the ones your enemy builds for themselves." "They're moving into their final positions." Pre's voice crackled over the secure channel, calm but laced with urgency. "My people have eyes on them. They've stationed observers at every choke point, and their cameras are ready. They think this is it, their grand finale." Jake glanced at Emily, who was meticulously reviewing their live security feeds. "They're so focused on their narrative," Jake said. They don't see how many cracks we've already found." Emily nodded, her expression steady. They've spent weeks building their stage, creating their story, but they've overlooked the fact that we've been scripting our own ending. Yeah. The warehouse district loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, illuminated only by the faint glow of strategically placed lighting systems. Jake and Emily watched from a secure location as Pry's team provided real-time updates. Chuck and Roy's people were busy coordinating movements, ensuring every piece of their plan was in place. "They're even rehearsing their roles," Emily remarked, watching as individuals in civilian clothes mimicked the behaviors of concerned residents. They wanted to look like the whole community is witnessing this event. Jake's phone buzzed with an update from Officer Thompson. "We've positioned undercover officers near the key choke points. If things escalate, we're ready to intervene." "They won't get the outcome they're hoping for," Jake said, setting down his phone. "We've accounted for every move they're trying to make." The plan Jake and Emily had constructed with Pry and law enforcement was precise and layered. While Chuck and Roy's group thought they were the puppet masters, Jake's team had worked quietly to ensure every string they pulled would unravel their scheme. Cameras, discreetly installed by Pry's team, captured everything: the staging, the fake residents, and the movement of equipment into the warehouse. Pry's next message was brief but decisive. "They're ready. Time to move." As Jake and Emily drove toward the warehouse, they followed the route Chuck and Roy had so carefully funneled them toward. Behind them, Pry's people and undercover officers maintained their positions, ready to act. "They think they're leading us into their trap," Jake said, as the warehouse came into view. "But they don't realize we're leading them into ours." Inside the warehouse, Chuck and Roy waited, their setup meticulous. Bright lights illuminated a central area filled with staged evidence meant to implicate both Jake and the Iron Wolves. Cameras were positioned to capture every angle, ensuring their version of events would dominate. But as Jake and Emily stepped inside, they brought with them something Chuck and Roy hadn't anticipated: live feeds from the hidden cameras documenting every aspect of their operation. Pry's team entered moments later, flanking Chuck and Roy's group, followed by undercover officers who secured the exits. "You've been busy," Jake said, his voice calm but cutting as he gestured toward the staged setup. "But you forgot one thing. The truth has been watching you the entire time." Chuck's smug expression faltered as the undercover officers stepped forward, revealing badges. Pry's people held their positions, ensuring no one could escape. The cameras Chuck and Roy had so carefully placed were now turned against them, capturing their reaction as their entire scheme collapsed. By the end of the night, Chuck and Roy were in custody, along with their key collaborators. The fabricated evidence, staged witnesses, and manipulated narrative all became part of the case against them. Their attempt to control the story had not only failed, but had also exposed their elaborate conspiracy. As the warehouse was cleared and the evidence cataloged, Pry approached Jake and Emily. "They thought they had us cornered," Pry said with a smirk. "Turns out they were the ones in the cage." Jake nodded, his arm around Emily's shoulders. "They underestimated the people they were trying to manipulate. That was their first mistake. And their last," Emily added, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Back home, as dawn broke, Jake and Emily sat on their porch, Buddy and Daisy resting at their feet. The neighborhood was quiet again, the tension finally lifted. "They thought they were writing the script," Emily said, her voice soft. "But we flipped the story." Jake smiled, looking out at the peaceful street. "Sometimes the best way to handle a trap is to let your enemy walk right into it and watch them fall." Jake took a deep breath as he approached the warehouse's main entrance, his focus razor-sharp. The scene was unfolding exactly as Chuck and Roy had planned, or so they thought. The carefully orchestrated concerned citizens had gathered in just the right spots, their cameras poised to record the narrative Chuck and Roy were determined to sell. The lighting, the evidence, the staging, it was all in place, Through his earpiece, Emily's voice was steady and calm. "They've got every angle covered, just like they planned. Cameras are live and they're watching for any sign of us entering." Jake's eyes scanned the perimeter, noting the positioning of Chuck and Roy's associates. Each one stood exactly where their intelligence had predicted, creating a seemingly airtight perimeter. But they had missed the most crucial detail. They weren't the only ones in control of the stage. "Pre's team is in position," Jake replied softly, his voice steady. "Honor prepared to activate. And our cameras are recording everything from the real angles." Inside the warehouse, Chuck and Roy were celebrating prematurely. The dim glow of their control room monitors reflected their confidence as they watched the feeds from their strategically placed cameras. They could see the crowd outside, the staging of the evidence, and the lights perfectly illuminating their setup. Every move Jake and Emily made seemed to fall right into their trap. "They're practically gloating." Emily's voice crackled in Jake's ear. "Pri's latest feed shows them toasting in the control room." Jake smirked. "Let them. The best part of a performance is the moment the actors realize they're not the ones running the show." The key to Jake and Emily's counter-strategy had been allowing Chuck and Roy to believe their plan was unfolding flawlessly. Every decoy, every delayed reaction, and every apparent vulnerability had been designed to draw them deeper into their own web. The Iron Wolves' hidden cameras and undercover officers had been capturing every detail of the setup, from the staged evidence to the coordinated crowd. "Pri, are we ready to move?" Jake asked over the secure channel. "We're ready," Pri confirmed. "All exits are covered. My people are documenting everything. Are you ready, sir?" "Uncontrollably," Pri replied. As Jake stepped into the warehouse, every head in the control room turned toward the main monitor. Chuck and Roy watched with smug satisfaction as he walked directly into the trap they'd spent weeks preparing. What they didn't see was the Iron Wolves' hidden cameras capturing their reactions, or the undercover officers quietly moving into position. Emily's voice came through Jake's earpiece. "The control room team is focused on you. They haven't noticed Pri's people entering through the east entrance." "Good," Jake replied. "Keep recording. This is the moment they've been waiting for." Outside, Stevens continued to pound the outside door. Finally, it was opened. Jake approached the staged evidence, deliberately stepping into the spotlight. Chuck and Roy's cameras captured his every move, just as they'd planned. But what their cameras didn't see was the coordinated sweep happening behind them. Minutes later, the lights in the warehouse shifted abruptly, revealing Pri and his team flanking the control room. Officers moved in to secure the exits, cutting off any chance of escape. Chuck and Roy's smug expressions turned to confusion as the reality of the situation hit them. "What's going on?" Chuck demanded, his voice panicked. Jake's voice echoed through the warehouse, calm and cutting. "You spent weeks crafting this scene, orchestrating every detail, but you forgot the most important part of any performance. The audience sees what the director wants them to see." Pri stepped forward, his tone sharp. "And we've been directing this from the start." The confrontation was swift. Undercover officers revealed themselves, taking control of the warehouse and securing Chuck, Roy, and their associates. The planted evidence, the staged witnesses, and even the control room feeds all became part of the case against them. The Iron Wolves' recordings, combined with law enforcement's documentation, painted a damning picture of the conspiracy. By dawn, the operation was over. Chuck and Roy's scheme was dismantled, their fabricated story exposed for what it was. The neighborhood that had been held hostage by their deception could finally breathe again. Jake and Emily returned home to Buddy and Daisy, who greeted them with wagging tails and relieved barks. Sitting on their porch as the sun rose, Jake reflected on the events of the night. "They thought they were the directors of this play," he said, smiling faintly at Emily, "but they didn't realize we were writing the script all along." Emily laughed softly. leaning into him, and the curtains come down on their final act. Jake's voice carried through the warehouse, calm yet firm, cutting through the tense air like a blade. You were so obsessed with controlling the narrative, so fixated on crafting the perfect trap, that you didn't notice the eyes on you every step of the way. Chuck and Roy froze, their confidence dissolving into disbelief as the realization dawned. The shadows, once their carefully curated props, now revealed law enforcement officers and iron wolves emerging from unexpected positions. Cameras that had been set to capture their staged victory instead recorded their shock and defeat. In the control room, the monitors flickered, showing their people being detained at every exit. The concerned citizens Chuck and Roy had planted were now facing undercover officers, their staged roles unraveling as they realized they had been surrounded. Phones and cameras that had been meant to document a fabricated story now captured the exposure of Chuck and Roy's scheme. Emily's voice came calmly through Jake's earpiece. All teams are secure, witnesses have been contained, the story they wanted to tell is over. Chuck stepped forward, his face red with fury. This isn't possible. We accounted for everything. How did you? Jake interrupted, his voice cutting him off. That was your second mistake. You thought the more complicated your plan, the more foolproof it was. But complexity leaves cracks, and we've been watching, documenting every single one. Roy, his face pale, glanced around at the officers and iron wolves closing in. You couldn't have known. We made sure, Jake smirked, gesturing toward the warehouse. Oh, we knew. Every sabotaged bike, every fake piece of evidence, every move you made, we were 2 steps ahead thanks to your overconfidence. Pry's voice came through the secure channel. Their comms are fully down, no way to call for help. All their escape routes are blocked. They're done. Jake glanced toward the control room, his voice sharp. You built a stage, Chuck, and you scripted your perfect performance. But you forgot the most important rule of theater. The audience only sees what the real director wants them to see. Chuck and Roy exchanged panicked glances as their control crumbled entirely. Officers stepped forward, securing them in cuffs, while their associates were rounded up. Pry's team documented every step, ensuring there was no room for denials or spin. Emily joined Jake on the warehouse floor, her tone calm but resolute. Their planted witnesses are realizing they've been played too. They're cooperating, handing over their recordings. And all falling apart. Jake nodded, turning back to Chuck and Roy, who now stood subdued, their bravado shattered. Ah, you spent weeks orchestrating this, thinking you'd outsmart everyone. But you forgot one simple truth. When you build a trap, you'd better be sure who's really walking into it. By the time the operation was complete, the warehouse was secured, and the evidence Chuck and Roy had staged had been cataloged and dismantled, alongside the mountain of proof against them. Their network of allies was exposed, and their fabricated story had been replaced with the irrefutable truth. As the dust settled, Jake and Emily stood outside the warehouse, the tension finally lifting. Pry approached, a rare grin breaking his stern demeanor. I have to admit, you two put on quite a show yourselves. Emily smiled faintly. We just made sure the right story was told. Jake glanced at the rising sun, Buddy and Daisy waiting for them back home. And the best part? They never saw it coming. This beautifully encapsulated story showcases how adversity can strengthen communities, challenge preconceived notions, and reveal unexpected allies. More often, Jake and Emily's journey, alongside Buddy and Daisy, serves as a testament to resilience, teamwork, and the power of unity in the face of calculated division. The transformation of their neighborhood, from a place gripped by fear and distrust to one of unity and mutual support, is truly inspiring. The Iron Wolves, initially seen as outsiders, proved that their strength lay not just in their camaraderie, but also in their ability to protect and contribute positively to the community. Chuck and Roy's meticulously crafted scheme not only failed, but ultimately highlighted the importance of transparency, trust, and the bonds that form when people come together. Their attempts to sow division inadvertently fostered a stronger, more connected neighborhood, where residents and the Iron Wolves worked side by side to ensure safety and mutual respect. This story is a reminder that even in challenging times, the very things that seem to divide us, like differences in appearance, background, or assumptions, can become sources of strength when approached with understanding and openness. Jake and Emily's ability to strategize and see the bigger picture, combined with the unexpected allyship of Pri and his team, is a powerful example of what can be achieved when people choose collaboration over conflict. The peaceful sounds of motorcycles patrolling, the strengthened relationships among neighbors, and the newfound sense of security for everyone involved are the real victories of this tale. It's a story that reminds us of the enduring power of unity and how, even in the most trying circumstances, communities can emerge stronger together. What lessons do you draw from this story? Feel free to share your thoughts and reflections. How has this resonated with your experiences of community, trust, or overcoming challenges?